we witness a clash between a group of wandering travelers and goblins, which was nothing unusual in this world. A world teeming with monsters. The travelers easily took down the villains. Among them was a young man who tore a goblin apart with his bare hands. That was our main character, Dalen. That's what he was called in this world. In his own world, he spent days in front of a computer, controlling battles with a mouse and keyboard. How he ended up in this virtual world remains unknown. But one thing was certain. He didn't plan to stay long. Dalen had a plan and he stuck to it. He spent 2 years clearing the tutorial and reaching Falchion, the Labyrinth city. It was the only way to enter the dungeon without being swarmed by monsters. Along the way, he gathered treasures, and there, he had a chance to return home. A wish stone, capable of granting anyone desire. As Dalen approached the city, the head of a trading company, Gallius, called out to him. For a while, they traveled together. The merchant offered our hero a job as a mercenary in his company. Dalen was stunned. He had never seen this event in the game before. He refused the offer. In response, the merchant overpaid him for his previous services, and they parted ways. But what had happened lingered in Dalen's mind for a long time. Eventually, he concluded that small changes might occur depending on his actions. He entered a tavern, one he had visited before, back when he saw this world through a screen. Moving deeper inside, he found what he was looking for. Lying before him was his own corpse, a knife buried in its back. This insanely difficult game had one incredible advantage. You could search your own corpse, getting extra experience points and restoring some of your items. Dalen was sure this time he would get to the end. In his world, he always liked difficult games. He had long since gotten bored with easy ones. But this game was difficult even for him. He was weak in the game. The same could not be said about the monsters he had to fight. As for the NPCs, they did not help. They were just waiting for the right moment to betray the player. He had tried to beat the game countless times, just as many as the sleepless nights he had spent on it. More than once, he had considered deleting it, but all the time he had invested made it too hard to let go. Back to the tavern, Dalen sat with a mug of wine. Staring at his own corpse, he wondered if it would have been better if this madness had been erased back then. The ability to level up from a corpse was incredible, but the downside was that you had to personally retrieve the body from where you died. Our player approached the corpse and confirmed the action. Loot body. At that very moment, his strength and combat mastery leveled up. And once again, something happened that threw Dalen into confusion. Had this character always had this perk, Dehaman armor combat technique? Well, no matter. It was a nice bonus. The thought quickly left his mind. As our hero headed for the exit, someone called out to him. It was the tavern owner, demanding a tax for the safety of his establishment and the food that had filled his stomach. By now, you're probably wondering, how exactly did our character die last time? So, these were the very events that led to his previous death. But this time, things were different. Dalen gave the tavern owner a proper shakeup. The innkeeper called for backup. That's when Dehaman armor combat technique came in handy. Our protagonist became like an unbreakable hunk of steel. With just a few swift moves, he sent the thugs flying. The fight even earned him some extra gold. That allowed him to rent a room at an inn, for a while at least. The night was sleepless. Dalen kept running through his next moves in his head. His character was weak, his money and experience points pathetic. But there was a way. After hundreds of failed attempts, his corpses were scattered all over the continent. All he had to do was collect them, and his stats would skyrocket. Time was against him. The end of the world was approaching. So, he made a decision. He had to act immediately. He remembered a special quest, one that could earn him gold and help him reach his corpses. At dawn, Dalen headed to the owner of the Raven's Nest. The tavern was closed, but that didn't stop him. He slipped inside. The room was silent, and no one answered his call. Pausing for a moment, he carefully knocked a specific rhythm against the wooden surface, a coded signal that triggered an immediate response. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, the furious tavern owner appeared. Her gaze was hostile, but upon seeing the key figure of our story, she calmed, just a little. The anger in her eyes gave way to surprise. She had never met this man before. After exchanging a few words, the tavern owner offered Dalen some tea. But he knew this gesture didn't mean friendship, and drinking it would be a mistake. Sienna, as she was called, was a powerful informant, and earning her trust wasn't easy. However, those who did small tasks for her could expect truly valuable rewards. Her first task for him, the case of the missing people on Small Street. Dalen stood by the entrance to the drainage system. He knew this place. One of his corpses was still there. Taking a step inside, he heard a fierce roar, filled with insatiable hunger. It was the very creature that had once been the end of him. Suddenly, a notification appeared, loot corpse. But to reclaim his skills, he would have to kill this bloodthirsty beast. Before Dalen stood a relatively small ogre. No surprise, as this was still the beginning of the game. The creature roared in human speech, complaining about its hunger. It was clearly delighted by the sight of a new potential meal. This was one of the bosses of Small Street. The battle began. Dalen skillfully dodged the ogre's blows, waiting for the right moment. Finally, he hurled the ogre into the wall. The impact was devastating, and the ogre's head was crushed. But regeneration kicked in immediately. Ugly growth sprouted from the wound, making the monster even more horrifying. The ogre, maddened, charged at the mercenary, but Dalen quickly sliced open its belly with his sword. Blood poured from the wound. The injury was severe, but not enough to kill it. Suddenly, from the damage, the creature regained some of its human consciousness. Gasping for breath, it spoke, telling a story of how it was once human. But everything changed after meeting people in cloaks and golden masks. They injected him with a black sludge, and it was that sludge that turned him into a monster. This information intrigued Dalen. However, the consciousness quickly faded from the ogre, and fury flared up in its eyes once more. Without waiting for it to completely lose its mind, Dalen struck the final blow. The creature's head fell to the ground. Dalen returned to Sienna. He dropped the ogre's head onto the table, along with the belongings of the victims, asking her to return them to their families. This act surprised her, but she didn't show it. Mercenaries rarely showed such care. After receiving his payment, he didn't linger and headed to the inn. That evening, our hero bent over his journal, reflecting on the day as he wrote on the papyrus sheet. This habit had developed ever since he found himself in the game. Through simple yet important things like keeping a journal, he tried to maintain a connection to reality. It reminded him of who he was, where he came from, and what needed to be done to return home. To follow his main goal, he had to prevent the end of the world in the game. That meant destroying countless monsters and villains. He recalled the ogre's words and decided that the first priority should be dealing with that group. He didn't want them becoming a source of problems down the line. A week has passed since the last events. During this time, the mercenary has taken down a couple dozen monsters that were terrorizing city. Because of this, he earned the nickname Hunter of the Small Street. Dalen returned to the Raven's Nest. Sienna's attitude toward him noticeably improved, but she was still annoyed that the mercenary kept showing up at the tavern outside of working hours. This time, she mentioned that a more interesting job had come up, with a decent reward. Plus, he'd have a partner. Here's the deal. This job came from one of the elder mages of the Magic Tower. They needed to find a mage apprentice who had gone missing in the sewers. On his way to the drains, Dalen was thinking, if he could find traces leading to the apprentice, the payout would be 1 florin. But if he managed to bring him back alive, the reward would be twice as much. After all, mages were very protective of their apprentices. Maybe the tower would even owe him a favor. Who knows when the help of mages might come in handy? A girl's voice snapped him back to reality. She was asking if he was the hunter of the small street. Turns out she was the promised assistant. The mercenary was so stunned that it was plain on his face. The girl quickly defended herself, saying she was a sewer cleaner. And despite her age, she'd be a huge help since she knew the tunnels by heart. Her name was Fenny. They set off, and along the way, the young assistant mentioned she'd been doing this job for 3 years already. Usually, people don't last more than a year in this job, but she was full of positivity and motivation. She really was a veteran in this field. They arrived at the location marked on the map. Dalen surveyed the area, relying on deduction. He guessed that the kidnapper might be a follower of the cult. He knew that if this creature managed to fully form, it could become dangerously powerful. There wasn't much time left before its full formation. Our character firmly decided that it had to be dealt with right now. He glanced to the side and something shimmered in the water. Reaching in, he pulled out a necklace with a one-time use protection spell. It belonged to the apprentice. There was no glow left in it, meaning it had already been used. It was clear that this was the mage's final destination. Dalen tensed and listened carefully. A moment later, he asked Fenny if she had any self-defense skills. To that, the girl confidently replied that she could take care of herself. The mercenary drew his sword and held up his torch. From the darkness, several figures emerged. Human-like bodies with frog-like heads resting on their shoulders. These were frogmen, low-level creatures, but surprisingly clever. They lunged at Dalen, but before they could reach him, the frog-like spawn hit the ground with their bodies sliced clean in half. Fenny let out a shriek, pointing at something in the distance. Turning around, the mercenary saw an entire squad of disgusting frogs. But no matter how many there were, he was sure he could take them on. And just like that, the bodies of all the creatures lay mutilated and lifeless in the sewer water. His assistant was in awe. Dallin shot her a warning glance, a look that clearly meant, don't let your guard down. Then he activated his night vision skill. Sure enough, out of nowhere, two more terrifying frogs appeared. The mercenary knocked one of them out, but the other managed to dodge and took off, running. They chased after it. This could be their chance to find the enemy's lair. Entering the chamber where the lone creature had led them, they saw exactly who Dylan had suspected. It was the exiled mage, Derek. This was their first time meeting face to face. The dark mage voiced his displeasure that his test subjects had fallen at the hands of the hunter. And since the opportunity to solve this problem had presented itself, he was more than happy to take it. At his words, more than 200 frogmen seemed to rise straight from the ground. Fenny shuddered, but after glancing at Dalen, she realized there was no need to worry. Our hero quickly assessed the situation and decided not to waste time on the small fry. His goal was the exile. He charged into battle, cutting down frogs with his sword and blocking attacks with his shield. But under the relentless assault, his sword shattered in half and cracks spread across his shield. Dellen's eyes burned with fury, filled with an unstoppable desire to end this once and for all. Using the armored combat technique skill, the mercenary sent the disgusting frogs blocking his way flying. The terrified dark mage, clearly intending to cast a spell, never managed to finish the incantation. And with that, he said his final goodbye to life. A prompt appeared, offering the mercenary's body as a potential vessel for the sex experiments. Derek had used it as a vessel to absorb the dragon blood that had formed within. It was a sight that was anything but pleasant. Dallin picked up the body, looted it, and leveled up his skills. Due to the events surrounding the body, something new was discovered. The dragon blood resurrection skill was unlocked. The remaining frogs fled in fear. The excited girl ran up to the mercenary and declared that she had never met anyone with such strength and courage before. After wandering through the sewer tunnels for a bit, they finally found the apprentice. We shift to the sex meeting hall, where they already knew of Derek's death. But who was responsible for it was still a mystery to them. However, it was clear that an elder mage had been involved. The sex followers did not approve of their allies' actions, kidnapping the apprentice. But it was much more complicated. He was merely a pawn in the kidnapping. The great apostle entered the hall furious, yet he had no intention of backing down from his plan. He simply announced that the uprising would happen later than originally planned. We find ourselves in Elgai's tower, with Sienna and Dalen present, waiting for the elder mage. To shorten the wait, the mercenary decided to check the character status window. His gaze stopped on the dragon blood resurrection line. It was one of those skills used on people that wasn't exactly legal, which was pretty obvious considering the circumstances under which it came to our hero. It wasn't a bad skill to have, though its cooldown time was quite long, making it hard to use in battle. His thoughts were interrupted by the elder, whose name was Felver Valentino. After offering Dalen some tea, he sat down. It was more like coffee, which triggered a flashback in our hero to a time before the games, to his old home. The peaceful mage placed a sack of coins on the table, 1 gold and 100 silver. Not bad at all. The conversation then shifted to a potential additional reward, more like an offer, the details of which were still undisclosed to us. We can only hope that we'll find out more about it soon. Dallin was strolling through the city streets in the evening, when he suddenly remembered that after the events in the sewers, his weapon was in terrible condition. He decided to head to Fenny's uncle, who was a blacksmith. And besides, the assistant promised to put in a good word for a discount. Just as he was almost at his destination, the mercenary heard the sounds of a heated argument. A tall man flew out of the smithy and landed loudly on the ground. Fenny screamed. The representatives of a trading company, which belonged to a sect, caused quite a stir. The blacksmith owed them money. They came to extort interest. Dalen stepped into the conflict. The collectors left, but most likely not for long. Uncle Fenny turned out to be no ordinary blacksmith. This NPC was known to our protagonist. His name was Roberon Azakiam, a master of mithril. In the second half of the game, he constantly improved his craft and created the best weapons and armor in the world. To have a conversation in a calm setting, the 3 familiar characters headed to the tavern. Over a mug of beer, the master craftsman revealed that he was unable to fulfill Dalen's request. because the trading representatives had seized his tools. On top of that, they tried to lure the blacksmith to work for them, offering to forgive his debt if he worked for 5 years. But he wasn't happy with that prospect, since after the term ended, he'd be stuck working in someone else's forge, which meant he could be left without a job at any moment. The mercenary, after hearing the blacksmith out and clarifying the amount of his debt, promised to take care of everything, in exchange for an exceptional weapon. As an advance, he took the blacksmith's axe, which happened to be with him. Of course, he didn't have the full amount, but he knew exactly who to turn to for help. Dalen went to a familiar character, Gally. For those who forgot, he's the owner of a trading company and once traveled with our hero. The request for a loan surprised the merchant, but after hearing the reason, he agreed without hesitation. Though rather than lending money, he decided to pay for a certain task, which he would reveal in a day. He also had a grudge against the trading company Telia. Telia was a group of cultists raised by the Apostles of Resistance. They had taken over most of the trade districts. Dalen thought about how he was already planning to deal with them, and now the circumstances had led him straight to it. His usual tactic of storming into the enemy's lair and punishing the bad guys was inappropriate this time. Since this was a legal organization, he had to take a different approach. First and foremost, he needed to help Fanny and his uncle. As the mercenary approached the forge, he saw another confrontation. This time, there were significantly more trading representatives, and they no longer bothered to disguise their true intentions as a simple debt collection. Roberon remained steadfast in his decision. One of the cultists grabbed his arm and lost it in an instant. Dalen stepped in. Luck had already been on the blacksmith's side twice. The mercenary cut down the cultists one by one. He activated the skill, Armored Combat Technique. Many cultists naively thought that an unarmed man couldn't cause much trouble. They rushed at the hunter in a crowd, but he quickly shattered their misconceptions. Not that it mattered anymore. It's unlikely the dead care about anything at all. Within minutes, the street was covered with dozens of lifeless bodies. But wait, Dalen noticed one pretending to be dead. He didn't finish him off just yet. He managed to get a bit of new information. The leaders of Telia had ordered the capture of all shop owners and anyone connected to trade in any way. There were still a few more questions he wanted answered. But just as the weakened man from the fight began to twitch, his body twisted and transformed into a monster. Dalen killed him before he could fully change. This was bad. They had learned to turn into creatures. There was no time to waste. Our hero handed the blacksmith, who was still shaken by what he had witnessed, a bag of gold to cover his debt and headed to Gally for the assignment. Gally stood by the window, slowly sipping his coffee. He was deep in thought about what he had just learned from Dalen. The Telia company had always been suspicious, but now they had started buying up goods in massive quantities. They were definitely planning something. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of shattering glass as something heavy crashed into him from behind. It was Dalen, who ordered the merchant to take cover under the bed immediately. A whistling sound grew closer outside the window, and within seconds, arrows struck the perimeter of the walls. The merchant, stunned, quickly scrambled under the bed. Dalen disappeared back through the window he had just entered from. In the courtyard, he was met by figures in black cloaks, wearing white and gold masks. As he cut them down, the mercenary thought this was a great opportunity to rack up some experience points. Their personal presence here meant their plan was close to being set in motion. After taking down 3 cultists, Dalen heard a voice behind him. Turning around, he saw a levitating black cloak with a silver mask. It never even crossed his mind that one of their leaders might show up. This was Stray Luther, a low-level vampire, an assassin who used poison and thrived in the dark. In the game, fighting him was tough. The mercenary wondered if he could even handle this battle outside of it. There was nothing left to do but fight him. Without waiting for the right moment, Dalen struck. The bloodthirsty creature managed to dodge. Our character noticed that he wasn't the only one attacking in a silver mask. Looking around, he indeed spotted a couple dozen white and gold masks. He should have focused on them first so they wouldn't be underfoot. The hunter took care of the snipers first. He activated the skill Armored Combat Technique. He scattered the rest. Only one remained. Dalen swung, ready to strike with his axe, when something green scattered through the air. It was poison-filled pouches from the silver mask. He'd wanted to use this trump card for a while, as he was sure it would have an absolute effect on humans, but he feared it might affect his allies. However, since only one ally remained, there was no reason to worry. Vampires could likely resist the poison's effect. The bloodsucker approached the lifeless shadow on the ground. He was certain this was the hunter who had caused the organization a lot of trouble. He simply went mad when he saw the shadow of the last of their allies. An attack came from nowhere. Our protagonist activated the Dragon Blood objection skill, allowing the freak to speak his last words. Before delivering a crushing blow, a system notification popped up about the corpse being consumed by the vampire. Dallin confirmed the action and leveled up his skills. Let's shift to Gally, who was pacing frantically around the room. It finally dawned on him that an assassination attempt had been set up against him. His thoughts were filled with plans for reinforced security. A black shadow flew through the window, and the merchant's hair stood on end, his legs buckled. He slid down the wall, foam forming at the corners of his mouth. His reaction to the poison, the fumes of which had filled the room, though not in a high enough concentration to kill. The shadow was Dallin. Gally, his voice trembling, called out to Dallin to get in the habit of using doors. Sienna entered the room and the men were surprised to see her there. She announced that she had obtained information of interest to the mercenary. Everyone present at the table sat down to have some tea and digest everything. Sienna shared that she had managed to find out which organization the Silver Mask belonged to. Dallin didn't expect to hear anything new, since he had already learned quite a bit over the past few days. But he was surprised. She had managed to get her hands on the Telia company's accounting book, from which it became clear which goods had been purchased in massive quantities. These were medicines, weapons, and metal, all things that would be useful during a rebellion. The book also contained a map showing the location of the warehouse where everything was stored. Heretics in mass had been spotted in this area, along with the kidnapped merchants and craftsmen. There were also bandits and wanderers aiding the rebels. This information allowed Dallin to start piecing together what was happening. The cultists intended to turn the bandits and wanderers into half-monsters, while using the skills and knowledge of the craftsmen to forge weapons. Dallin also hoped to enlist the help of the Bronze Guards for this task, thanks to Sienna's connections. The informant handled the job with flying colors. The guards were willing to help, but they warned that attacking the building without solid evidence would be difficult. The mercenary decided to take care of that part of the plan himself. Let's shift to enemy territory. The night shift of the guards. We can observe two cloaked figures in black masks. One of them was endlessly complaining about the relentless cold. In his opinion, the bandits and wanderers would be doing a great job with this task. The second interrupted his grumbling, stating he didn't want to be a witness to such speeches. Before he could finish his preachy, sect-like monologue, he crashed to the ground with a loud thud. The second guard turned in confusion, and just like his partner, ended up knocked out. Dallin scanned the area, calculating his next move. His plan was simple: get past the guards and enter the warehouse through the first floor, then set the building on fire. And the Bronze Guards, who just happened to be patrolling the area, would be putting out the fire while discovering the illegal activities of the cultists. The plan was flawless, but there was one detail that kept troubling the hunter. The building was quite large and had 5 whole floors. The owner of the Telia company was almost certainly inside. If there was chaos on the first floor, would he stay in the building or manage to escape? So, the mercenary decided to act differently. While the guards caused a commotion downstairs, he activated the leap skill. He leaped onto one of the buildings, which allowed him to sneak into a prison-like space where an entire army of half-monsters was held. These creatures reminded him unpleasantly of ogres. At the end of the dungeon, by the throne, stood a man. It was Achilles Philonom, the owner of the Telia Trading Company. The battle began immediately. The Dark Priest quickly realized the rumors were true. The strength of this hunter was unnatural for a human, equal to that of a monster. And his victory over several apostles was no accident. The mage had a strong reason to eliminate the mercenary. He wanted to carry out the rebellion plan as soon as possible. A weapon fight would clearly be lost, so he decided to resort to magic and cast a spell. The spell awakened the half-monsters, but full activation would take some time. Dallin decided to use this time to weaken their master. He alternated between axe strikes and hand-to-hand combat. One of his blows was so powerful that the opponent was knocked back and cracks appeared in his armor. Achilles was disoriented, his surprise knowing no bounds. This man had pierced his armor with his bare hands. Something needed to be done immediately. The mage judged that enough time had passed since the first spell. The creatures were ready for battle. And with that, he opened the cages. The necromancer realized that he had only one chance to kill this man. The hunter's attention shifted to the monsters. It was a way to set up an ambush and strike from behind. Dallin effortlessly scattered the half-monsters, and for a moment lost sight of the dark mage, who decided to take advantage of this and was preparing to strike, which in his opinion should have been devastating. But alas, Dalen blocked it with his axe, which shattered into pieces. This was the priest's last chance, which failed, and our protagonist activated the skill, Dragon's Blood Revival, and killed the owner of the sinister trading company. Dalen looted the corpse of his opponent. He remembered the circumstances when this character became a corpse. He had thought that if he could use both a sword and magic at the same time in battle, he could make it to the end. But unfortunately, that time had been fatal, unlike the current battle, which ended favorably for Dalen. After looting the body, he gained the skill Fire Arrow and improved his magical power and stamina. The battle was over, with some of the guards being wounded. But the main objective of the plan had been achieved. The apostle who owned the company was dead, as were most of his comrades. The warehouse was burning in flames. Although some of the sectarians managed to flee, and they probably wouldn't abandon their plans, since the great apostle was still alive, but the implementation of their plans was clearly delayed. Dalen was already preparing to leave the scene when he was called out to. It was the commander of the Bronze Guards, Gawain. He expressed his gratitude to the hunter, who had greatly contributed to the fight against crime in the city. By the way, it was he who recommended the mercenary to the Elgaia Tower. Our hero was pleased to make the commander's acquaintance. During the conversation, Dalen felt an overwhelming fatigue. He checked the skill window and discovered that his body had a side effect applied. It might have happened because only his strength stats were being heavily increased. The character took this into consideration. The next day, Dalen was walking the streets of the city in search of a new forge, which was provided by Galley's trading company for Roberon, so he could start fresh. Upon entering, he was greeted by Fanny. She was happy to see her friend, who had helped her and her uncle. The blacksmith had just finished the work the mercenary had assigned him. He was more than satisfied with the result. Acquiring new armor and weapons meant a significant improvement in the quality of combat. After the forge, the mercenary went to meet with Commander Gawain, who had scheduled the meeting, to inform him that the heretics had gathered the remaining people together, and the 8th territory of the eastern region had fallen under their control. No one expected this to happen just 2 days after the events at the warehouse. The guards had suffered casualties during the battle and barely managed to gather enough people to set up a defensive line at the 8th district. Dalen was shocked. Unexpected situations continued to arise that hadn't been present in the game. But there was something that still brought him comfort. If events that the character studied hadn't repeated for several hundred years, it meant that he was moving in the right direction. Gawain invited the mercenary to attend the commander's meeting of the districts. He expected him to contribute to the further development of events, but he didn't even imagine how significant his contribution would be. The speech was delivered by the commander of the 7th District Guards, a rather suspicious NPC. He claimed that if there was no active intervention in the 8th District, but simply blocking the streets leading out of it, that would be more than enough. He argued that without the necessary supplies, the heretics would die on their own. The commander of the 8th District Guards was outraged by such a speech, as it meant the willingness to sacrifice the citizens. Dalen supported him. No one had noticed him before. The commanders were outraged by the presence of outsiders at the council. Gawain diffused the situation by introducing our hero and bringing them up to speed, explaining that he played a significant role during the warehouse raid. The outrage was replaced with admiration, except for the commander of the 7th District. Something clearly went wrong with his plan. Dalen continued, justifying his position by stating that if the heretics were just blocked, their numbers would only grow. Due to their ability to turn people into half-monsters, which would lead to a counter-offensive from the enemy, the mercenary declared that they must strike first. Among the commanders, approval was growing. Only one was in a rage, though he was carefully hiding his indignation. Someone declared that while the plan of action was obvious, there weren't enough reinforcements for an active assault. Dalen reassured them that the reinforcements were already on their way. In fact, they were already here. The room shook as if an earthquake had begun, and those present were bewildered. Running outside, they saw hundreds of people in cloaks, and the person leading them removed his cloak. It was the elder mage from the magical tower Elgaia, who greeted Dalen and told him that he was glad that his help was needed. This was the offer, the additional reward for saving the apprentice. At the negotiation table, all the key figures were gathered, except for the guard of the 7th District. Probably he had more important matters to attend to. Although his absence worked in their favor, as he didn't inspire trust, Dalen announced the plan. The commander of the 8th District was entrusted with overseeing the garrison. The Bronze Guards, led by their commander, the elders, and the mages, together with Dalen, would enter the mines and strike at the heretics. With that, preparations were complete. As they approached the entrance to the mine, the elder mage warned that he sensed the presence of dark magic. Movement came from the middle. Someone was running, and in a moment, the figure became clearer. It was something resembling a half-monster, dressed in the attire of the commander of the 7th District. It was him, but his body seemed to be twice as large, and his face, or rather what was left of it, looked as if it had been subjected to high temperatures and melted like candle wax. He begged for help and expressed his indignation that the heretics had betrayed him. The scene caused dissonance, a traitor speaking of betrayal. Dalen was grateful for his instincts not to trust this person. From the mine emerged a cloak with a silver mask, which pierced the grotesque body of the commander with a hand, as if it were a saber. Through the mask, a twisted grin could be seen. He was pleased to see his guests, and his self-satisfied speech made it clear that his supporters would gladly offer them as sacrifices. In the name of the great cause, Dalen had already made up his mind to destroy this scoundrel. But looking at the commander, Dalen could tell by his gaze that he had personal scores to settle with this guy. This creature had once devoured Gawain's mother and had delighted in mocking it, bringing Gawain into a fit of rage. The elder mage intervened, placing his hand on the bronze guard commander's shoulder, convincing him that it was not worth focusing solely on the silver mask, that he was not alone here. He then cast a spell that dissipated the mist, revealing a couple dozen more cloaked figures. The exposed heretics took a battle stance. Behind them, something huge sloshed out of the mine carelessly. It was a monster from hell, seeming to be a dozen monsters squashed into one mass, with faces scattered all over its body, legs protruding from its shoulders, and thin arms hanging from all sides. But the main two massive paws with sharp claws were also present. Dalen mentally plotted the sequence of events. The elder would fight the mages. The commander would deal with the lizard-like figures in cloaks, and Dalen would keep the monster for himself. He approached this battle with anticipation as it promised a good amount of experience points. The monster was huge, and because of this, it was relatively slow, but its blows were powerful. Dalen guessed that if this creature was from hell, it was made of hellish mana, and it must have a core. He tried to estimate its probable location, and he rushed to strike. One of his blows caught the head and almost split it in two. The regeneration was immediate, and it didn't give the monster much trouble. The mercenary skillfully dodged the annoying protrusions, similar to arms, but at some point, he decided to get rid of them, cutting them off one by one. The warrior activated armor combat technique, and waiting for the right moment, struck again to the head. This time not using his weapon, but under the effect of the skill, the blow was many times stronger. It proved devastating for the monster. Dalen shoved his hand into the spot where the head had once been, and ripped out the core. Activating the fire arrow skill, he shattered it to pieces. The faces scattered across the monster's body shrieked. The scream was horrifying, but Dalen realized that it was foretelling something bad, and he couldn't afford to relax. From the mine tunnel, a rising noise was heard, and in an instant, dozens of monsters poured out. Commander Gawain took them on, calling out to the hunter to go search for the great apostle. Scanning the battlefield, Dalen was sure the guards and the elder mage's minions would manage without him. The clash between the commander and the lizard-like heretic, who had eaten his mother, did indeed happen, and it was in full swing. The elder mage watched from the side but didn't intervene. Gawain needed to settle the score on his own. At his feet was one of the evil supporters, exhausted but still able to speak. He declared that despite losing the battle, their ominous plan would still be carried out. And specifically, this would happen in a way that no one expected. Moving deeper into the tunnel, the hunter saw a horrifying sight. In front of him stood the great apostle, who had sold his soul to the devil. From his back protruded 8 enormous tentacles in all directions. He had made a pact with the low-ranking demon, Arachne. Advancing a little further, our hero was stunned. This was something he hadn't expected. 2 windows popped up in front of him about corpse selection. 6th corpse of the apostle in a silver mask. Captured corpse of the great warrior. The second one was clear, but the first raised questions. Having been in his world, the gamer had gone through this game 1,000 times. And not at all because he dedicated his life to gaming, but rather played for pleasure. That's why he didn't always finish the main storylines. One of them was on the side of evil, but not finishing this storyline, he couldn't have guessed that their priest was capable of even killing his own followers in the name of a great cause. Dalen assessed the situation And because of the tentacles, the enemy had no unprotected spots. Even though the demon with whom the contract was made was of low rank, he still remained a demon with incredible regeneration. The hunter skillfully dodged the tentacles. At one point, the mercenary thought the demonic creature had disappeared. But no, it was just moving through space with incredible speed. Our hero waited for the right moment for an active attack, but it never came. The creature landed a successful hit using poison in the process. Dalin's stamina recovery significantly dropped. It was the same as in the previous battle, which had been a complete failure. The tactic was the same, and it wasn't about lacking power, but about endurance, which was being drained by the creature's instant regeneration. At some point, the battle paused, and the main character had to act. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Otherwise, the moment of returning home would be delayed by an entire game life. And then a plan formed, and it was only left to bring it to life. Activating the jump skill, he prepared to strike with his fist. The half-demon wrapped his body in tentacles, hoping they would serve as his shield, but alas, Dalin pierced him through. Several tentacles stabbed in return, striking our hero, after which he activated the Dragon's Blood Resurrection skill, his body igniting. The demon recoiled in horror. It caused him significant damage. He was about to push his opponent away, to reduce the distance. But the tentacles holding Dalin simply refused to obey. Due to the fire, regeneration was greatly reduced. The protagonist began delivering crushing blows. Next episode, the almighty apostle, weakened, lay on the ground. With blood oozing from the wounds where the tentacles had recently been, he began a monologue talking about the purpose of his life. It was revenge for his exile. He secured the support of evil forces to destroy the last bastion of humanity, Falchion, along with the Diamond Palace, which was the core of the city's power. He wanted to create a new retrogressive order under divine will, summing up his speech by saying that this outcome was destiny. Dalin interrupted him, expressing his own opinion on what he had heard, claiming that the destiny the great apostle believed in was a lie, that every person only has freedom of will, and everything that happened to him was solely his fault and the result of his choices. With those words, he ended the life of Televino Cycle, the great apostle, servant of the devil himself. The system window offering to loot the two bodies appeared again. Dalin confirmed the action. A new skill, Instant Freeze, was discovered. Stamina and mana strength stats increased by 1 point, and the strength stat increased by +4. Dalin flinched. If his strength increased by 4 points at once, and he couldn't handle the sudden unbalanced jump, it could end fatally for him. No, he had to manage. He absolutely had to return home. Then something happened that left him confused. He found himself at the snowy foot of a mountain with a cabin on the horizon. This place resembled the start of the game very much. Dalin didn't understand if it was a dream or if he had really died. Could it really be starting all over again? Closing his eyes, the hero realized that his physical body was far from this place. But what was happening then? He would have to figure that out. He decided to visit the cabin. Entering the cabin, Dalin froze in place. It was his room, from his world, and sitting at the computer was himself, spending time playing the game. Our protagonist caught himself thinking that this wasn't a game at all, that all those times he hadn't finished the game, countless NPCs had been killed, and all the worlds where he gave up were destroyed, and all of that was his fault. It was his original sin, and even if he succeeded and was able to stop the destruction, it didn't mean he could atone for his guilt. However, it was the only way. Dalin made a promise to himself that this time he wouldn't give up. A pop-up window notified that a new area had been unlocked. Dalin regained his senses, and all his stats, except strength, had increased by 1 point. Experience points also increased. The mercenary didn't understand what had happened, but after a while he got back on his feet and headed toward his allies. Upon exiting the mine, he saw that the battle had ended. Creatures lying lifeless on the ground. There were wounded among his own, and the elder mage was providing first aid using magic. Gawain was sitting on the body of the lizard. He had succeeded in killing the one who had wronged his family. Among the people from the tower, the hunter noticed the recently saved apprentice. He was happy to see him. One of the potential causes of destruction had been stopped. But Dalin knew this was only the beginning. Ahead lay battles with creatures far stronger than the heretics. He was ready for them. After finishing the healing, the elder approached Dalin. He was glad to see him. But he looked into the hero's eyes and asked if he had unlocked any new territories. The mercenary was puzzled. The mage surely knew something, and he wanted to ask him many questions, but decided to put that off for later, agreeing to meet with the elder a bit later. After resting for a moment from the recent events, Dalen headed to the crow's nest. Upon entering, he was surprised to see the tavern packed with people, and with his arrival, all eyes turned to him and people began whispering. Before talking to Sienna, our hero decided to treat himself to a drink. His solitude was interrupted by an arrogant man who insisted on keeping him company. And when he was rejected, his mood shifted to anger. Drawing his saber, he began threatening Dalen. A second later, his body was pierced with a series of crossbow bolts. An enraged Sienna declared that no one in her tavern was allowed to draw a weapon. Calling the mercenary, she disappeared into her office. There were many tasks from last week piled up on the table. Dalen remarked that it would be nice if the number of tasks could be reduced to something more manageable. Sienna asked if there were any preferences, to which the hunter immediately replied that he needed potions to increase stamina and rituals for vision. Sienna shuffled through the papers and picked up one of them. This task was left by a disciple of the Holy Knights, and it involved defeating the devil of the Labyrinth and retrieving the holy sword that was stolen from him. This was exactly what he needed, as this task gave him the opportunity to enter the labyrinth. Dalen asked to arrange a meeting with the client. After discussing everything, the tavern owner took a bag of gold and a golden insignia out of her desk, which confirmed that Dalen had become a golden-ranked mercenary, a reward for the assignment from Gawain. Dalen arrived in the second region of Falchion, paying the guards significantly less than the usual tax rate, since he had become a golden mercenary, which granted him some privileges like this one. This was where the entrance to the labyrinth was located, where he could find the wish stone. But before heading there, he had to meet with the disciple of the sacred knights. Her name was Lucia. She possessed a strong will and faith. Though she was tough with her competitors, she was merciful to people. When Dalen arrived at the designated meeting place, he found Lucia in a quarrel with a tall mercenary, and he intervened in the conflict, effectively cutting him off at the root. During dinner, Lucia shared the details. The matter was that the sacred knights were guarding one of the labyrinth's roads, specifically the crack located in the southwestern region of the continent. The surrounding area had long been a road, so there were no real barriers at the exit, meaning monsters could appear at any moment. Because of this, before heading to the crack, the knights visit the safe zone in Falchion to prepare. The conversation then turned to Lucia's partner. His name was Barrett Streeman. He received the title of knight about 2 months ago and went to Falchion, after which he never returned. News reached the sacred knights that one of the 12 holy swords had been stolen, and it was stolen by Barrett. If the sword had chosen him on its own, he should have officially declared it. Lucia didn't want to believe that he had really stolen it. After listening, Dalen asked which specific sacred knights would be going with them into the labyrinth. The answer was disheartening. Monster activity had increased, and all the knights were engaged in the confrontation. But that didn't scare the mercenary. He told Lucia that they would head into the labyrinth the very next day. Dalen still had a meeting scheduled with the elder, so he headed there. The mage didn't come alone. He had his apprentice with him. The mercenary noticed that the apprentice had matured. He must have learned a lot in the battle with the heretics. Looking at the elder, the hunter asked him to share information about the new territories, to which the mage replied that it was better to see everything with his own eyes. He didn't want the apprentice to be present and sent him to rest. The apprentice was disappointed, but followed the mage's orders. The elder explained to Dalen that it was too early for Tommy to witness how the territory scene was unfolding, since an unfamiliar flow of mana could confuse his consciousness. After that, the elder cast a spell, and before them, as if by magic, a projection of the mage's territory unfolded. He explained that the territory was created in an imaginary world and would be summoned into this reality, and it would impose many possibilities on the restrictions of this world. This, in fact, was the meaning of using new territories. Dalen began to understand. The mage looked at him and asked if he would be able to use the territory. Dalen answered with doubt. The elder reassured him, saying that it would take time to adapt to the new circumstances before taking any action. The mercenary asked what abilities the mage's territory had, to which the elder replied that there were several, but they were mainly based on reading the memories of the earth. The earth records the passage of time for everyone who steps on it. Thus, the mage could see both the past and the future of those who interested him. The mercenary had another question, one that had been on his mind since he first arrived in this world. But there was no one to ask such a question. He inquired about what he really was. The answer to that has not yet been demonstrated. The events of the next day unfold before us. Dylan and Lucia arrived at the border tower of the Labyrinth. They needed to wait a bit. Lucia was very nervous. It was clearly visible on her face. In fact, Dalen had met her before and knew what an important NPC she would become in the future. And looking at the beads of sweat rolling down her face, he realized that right now he was witnessing the past of the person who would one day be called the Devil Slayer. The people present began to stir. A portal to the labyrinth opened before them, and our main characters immediately entered it. In a split second, they plummeted to the ground. That was the first floor of the labyrinth. There was no one around as unstable mana waves randomly pulled people in. Glancing at the stars, Dalen oriented himself based on their position and figured out which direction the Devil's Cave was in. To get there, they had to cover quite a distance, considering that the longer they waited, the stronger the devil would become. So the heroes set off. But as soon as they moved, wolves, Null scouts, appeared out of nowhere. The mercenary activated the skill Jump and charged into battle. He cleaved the riders' heads off and mounted one of the wolves. Dallin and Lucia were riding a wolf speeding toward its lair. Sure, they didn't really need to go there, but the mercenary knew the habits of riding wolves. After losing their rider, they always returned to a safe place. Why not take advantage of that and cover a long distance in a short time? However, this plan had one serious drawback. Gnolls were waiting for them there. They weren't the most fearsome opponents, but their numbers were worrisome. Lucia suggested retreating, but Dallin saw it as an excellent opportunity to gain more experience. Without hesitation, he charged into battle, striking Gnolls left and right. His companion had no choice but to grab her weapon and join the slaughter. Lucia held her own in battle, but after a couple dozen Gnolls had fallen, Dallin noticed her fatigue. It wasn't surprising. Despite her future potential, right now she was still just an apprentice with extensive theoretical knowledge, which she immediately put to use. Calling out to Dallin, she shouted that she knew how to make the Pelugian retreat. They needed to reach their leader and rip off his collar. Two windows about picking up corpses popped up before the hero's eyes. This place was already familiar to him. He had been defeated twice by the local leader, and now it was time to take revenge. Resolutely heading toward the main enemy, he caught sight out of the corner of his eye that Lucia had taken a step forward, intending to follow him, but then immediately stopped. She had spent too much energy battling the scouts and simply couldn't continue. However, what surprised her was something else. Dallin wasn't showing the slightest sign of fatigue. Meanwhile, the mercenary approached the monstrous Gnaw leader. He was several times bigger than him, and in the future, he was destined to become infamously known as the servant of an evil god. The giant, looking the man up and down, inquired what purpose he had come for and why he was destroying his tribe. Dallin noted that if he was speaking human language, obviously, a contract with the Dark Patron had already been sealed. And since it required sacrificing 10 people, wasn't that a compelling reason for his actions? The mercenary decided not to waste much time on talk and began to crush the beast with blows. Lucia squealed. At some point, she saw the monster clench the mercenary in its huge paw. But that was just our hero's trick. Dallin grabbed the monster's paw with both hands and used his freeze skill. After that, he activated the armor combat technique skill and struck the icy growth, which eventually broke off. Thus, the wolf leader lost one of his limbs, but that only made him laugh. Chuckling, he explained that when he sacrificed 10 people, the god granted him intelligence, another 20 people, the strength to crush stones, and when another 30, the power of instant regeneration. After his words, indeed, a paw appeared in place of the stump, as if nothing had happened to it. The fierce chieftain lunged at the hunter, who skillfully dodged and parried the blows. Dallin thought that this time the contract had been signed way earlier, and maybe he'd indirectly helped make that happen by getting involved in the events. Lucia caught her breath and decided that while the mercenary was dealing with the main guy, she'd handle the rest. The regeneration ability was a pretty good thing. But did that bastard know his opponent had the power of fire? Dallin conjured a fireball and lobbed it at the mounted Gnoll, who managed to dodge it but was clearly spooked. Clutching at his last chance to stay alive, he offered Dallin a deal. He had a chest full of relics from the people he'd sacrificed. Our main character took note of that. To claim that chest, he didn't have to leave his opponent alive. Returning to his companion, the hunter praised her for how well she handled the rest of the wolf-like creatures. Dallin looted the two corpses, earning 1 point in endurance and 2 in skill. He even picked up a new skill. This time it was Lapentella's crushing sword. Another pawn of Anaxagus bid farewell to life. Furious, he bested both the commander and the warrior who followed him. Another raiding squad arrived at the Cave Devil's Hall, ready to kill the demon. The demon decided not to even bother with such a trivial thing, and he cast a spell, turning the corpse of Barrett lying in the hall into a puppet, which took care of the group. The travelers pitched a tent for the night. By the campfire, Dalen sat. It was his turn on watch, and he opened his character's status window. He was glad his endurance reached 20, and his strength gap shrank tenfold, which meant that a situation like the one in the mine shouldn't happen again. The best reward was the C-rank skill, La Pantella's crushing sword, and the hero really wanted to see it in action. Dellen remembered the words of the elder mage. The answer to his question was that, in Earth's memories, our character's age was 2 years and 1 month. That was exactly how long it had been since he entered the game, which meant that the player's body was created at the same time he was reincarnated in this world. Somehow, elements of the game coexist with this reality. But why he ended up here, Dallin still didn't understand. Maybe this is how he's forced to atone for his past playthroughs. One could debate it forever, but nothing could be stated with certainty. So our character decided to focus on his main objective, namely the Stone of Wishes. Lucia appeared. She came out earlier than her scheduled shift, unable to sleep. She kept thinking about the words of a low-ranking mercenary who saw her comrade's death. Setting off on a journey through the labyrinths, she hoped to find Barrett alive. And if the information they had learned was true, all that remained was to find the sword. It was hard for her mind to accept that her companion had stolen the holy sword, but possessing it meant gaining considerable power. Besides, Barrett wasn't alone. There were other adventurers with him. In that case, he should have easily dealt with a low-ranked demon. What had really happened was yet to be discovered. Lucia made a decision. If her companion had perished in battle with the devil, she would remember him as someone to be proud of. Dallin noted that this sacred knight should be grateful, that he had such a friend. Lucy thanked him for those words. The next second, Dallin caught an arrow midair with his hand. It was meant for his companion. Dallin redirected the arrow toward the one who had fired it, piercing them straight through. The body collapsed lifelessly to the ground. Behind him, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed. A group of people was closing in. Dallin found it strange that he hadn't sensed these scoundrels earlier, given his heightened awareness. Among them was the same low-ranked mercenary who had been pursuing Lucia. He thirsted for revenge. Calling out to his underlings, he gave the order to kill our heroes. Dallin turned to Lucia, noting that this was a good opportunity to get testimony from a witness to her comrade's death. She remained silent in response, merely drawing her weapon from its sheath. Their opponents turned out to be rather slow in battle, and had clearly overestimated their chances by engaging in this fight. The low-ranked mercenary didn't bother to hide his rage, and began to run for it. Of course, that wouldn't save him. Our protagonist wasn't about to let him go so easily. He gave chase, calling out to Lucia to handle the rest. Dallin activated the jump skill and landed right on top of the villain. He was about to ask a couple of questions when someone interrupted. It was a man who pleaded with him to stop killing his comrades. He was interested in the chest that had fallen into our hero's hands after the battle with the Gnolls, and he offered a deal. In exchange for an item that could transmit sound over long distances. Now it was clear how Dallin hadn't noticed their approach. It was a decent offer, but the authenticity of the item needed to be verified. The mercenary stood up to step closer, but that was exactly the plan. The man pulled out a pistol and was just about to fire, when Dallin knocked him out cold. This person turned out to be a gold-ranked mercenary, and judging by his name, he was from the kingdom. Our hero once again turned his attention to the low-ranked mercenary, who was once again trying and failing to escape. Dallin got straight to the point and asked who had attacked the sacred knight, as it was obvious he hadn't died at the hands of the devil. The pathetic mercenary admitted that it was his doing. He had thought that if the sacred knight was wounded, just like the demon, he could claim both the holy sword and the raid rewards at the same time. Lucia overheard this as she finished off the remaining bandits and hurried over to assist Dallin. The pathetic coward began begging for mercy, but the heroine was no longer listening. She only warned him not to hope for a quick death. Lucia thoroughly battered the mercenary, but he was still alive and desperately tried to convince her to spare him. But that was out of the question. The knight's apprentice plunged her sword into him, a sword with the ability to summon flames forged from divine power. White fire that smote demons, burning everything in its path. It kept regenerating the victim's nerve cells, forcing them to feel every ounce of pain until the end. When it was all over, Dallin approached his companion and asked if she was all right. to which she responded with agreement. They decided to set out immediately, as neither of them was likely to get any sleep. By the time the travelers reached the Devil's Cave, they had been in more than one skirmish. Dallin looted every possible corpse along the way and had become quite a powerful character. At first glance, the cave didn't really resemble a devil's lair, as there was absolutely nothing inside. After venturing a bit deeper, they ran into a dead end. Odd, since there was no other way forward. The mercenary reached out and touched the wall. The next moment, it exploded. In its place, the massive body of a cave demon emerged. He declared that he had been watching them ever since they entered the labyrinth and had been waiting for them eagerly. Overcome with emotion, Lucia immediately lunged at the hellspawn, driven by her thirst for revenge for Barrett, only to be swiftly repelled. It was unclear why a low-level demon, one that even adventurers could normally defeat, was this powerful. After observing for a moment, Dalen noticed that behind the demonic creature lay the sacred sword, which meant it had begun absorbing its power. In that case, our hero would have to give it his all. He also had an ace up his sleeve, using the terrain to his advantage. That is, using its properties to create something impossible in this world. The demon immediately realized his intentions, and he wasn't pleased. The hunter warned his opponent that things were about to get tough for him, to which the demon arrogantly declared that he was undefeatable under any circumstances. Quite the overconfident claim. He launched powerful strikes at Dallin, but our hero skillfully dodged each one. Gradually increasing his endurance had definitely been worth it. In the past, the mercenary would have surely been destroyed in such circumstances. Waiting for the right moment, Dalen delivered counterattacks. The demon noticed that his body wasn't regenerating. He quickly realized that it was due to the territory's effects, and decided that sacrificing his own body wasn't worth it. And he summoned the body of the devoted, defiled knight. For Dylan, it was a surprise. He looked at the opponent's armor and saw the symbol of the sacred knight, realizing who was in front of him. He didn't understand how a low-ranking demon could control Barrett. But then, noticing the chain around the knight's neck, everything became clear. It was Halman's chain, a powerful sacred relic, capable of forcing a captured enemy to obey. It was important to deal with him quickly, since the demon could fully recover in the meantime. Lucia called out to Dellen. She took the enslaved Barrett onto herself, sending the mercenary after the devil. The demon still managed to regenerate, speeding up the process with the holy sword. He rushed at the mercenary using a new weapon, and the blow was strong enough. Our hero, without hesitation, finally decided to try out his new skill, crushing sword of Lapentella. This surprised the devil as much as the new territories. For a while, the battle was fought with swords. The demon's weapon couldn't withstand the pressure from Lapentella's sword and shattered into pieces. After that, Dallin destroyed the enemy. During the fight with Barrett, Lucia remembered the old days, when they first started their night training and fought with prop weapons. She had never managed to claim victory. Lucia teased that her companion was so strong that he caused irritation, claiming that a future commander had to be like that. The girl snapped out of her thoughts and back to reality. She knew for sure that in this battle, she had to win, even though it wasn't that easy. The blows came one after another, sweeping, powerful, and not all of them could be blocked. Lucia fell to her knees, and for a moment, the clash paused. The girl decided to end this, looking at the face of the defiled knight. She thought she saw the old Barrett. The expression clearly showed that he was grateful for her decision. With tears in her eyes, Lucia pierced her companion. Dylan watched this scene from the side. He comforted his companion by saying that Barrett would be happy. In his last moments, he was with a friend. We observed the dialogue between two characters inside the order. It was a knight whose face is not revealed to us, and the Ashen Witch. They were discussing the events of the cave devil's death and his defiled servant. They were up to something, and their plans were clearly not pure. Let's return to the cave, Dalen suggested, hiding the fact that Barrett was enslaved by a demon, and allow people to remember him as a sacred knight who died in battle with the demon. Lucia agreed with his words. The companions went to the branch of the Order of Sacred Knights in Falchion. They were greeted by a representative of the administration, Albus. He said that Dalin's deeds deserve personal recognition from the captain. But for the Order, these are not the best of times, and he is not present. As compensation for the completed task, the mercenary received a bag with 30 gold coins and a recommendation for the Sacred Mark. This was a good reward since the Sacred Mark is a unique skill of the Order of Sacred Knights, granted by the God of War, which allows the effective use of divine power. It can be used to increase physical strength as well as to enhance magic, and for many other purposes. Dellen was supposed to go to the chasm, since only the captain and his deputy could cash in this recommendation. And they were exactly there. The hero wasn't opposed to going there, since it was full of his corpses. In addition, Albus placed before Dalen a chest with a defiled sacred relic, the Chain of Halman, which the Order lost more than 400 years ago. He explained that using such items for the Order is considered illegal, so Dalen, not being bound by such obligations, could acquire the relic in exchange. Lucia intervened. She was outraged and stated that this mercenary was not one of those who can be persuaded by flattery. After that, she took the chest with the relic and simply gave it to Dalen, explaining that it was her trophy and she had the right to do with it as she pleased. The hero was surprised. In previous times, this hadn't happened. These scattered dreams. Dalen turned to Albus so that he would articulate what was required of him. After a brief hesitation, he explained that someone within the Order wants to acquire the Holy Sword. A wave of anger overwhelmed Lucia. They had just dealt with Barrett, and now someone else had begun a hunt for the sword? Albus continued his story, explaining that a few days ago he received a letter, and upon rereading it, he discovered the encrypted words, theft, ambush, and betrayal. Based on this, a traitor had infiltrated the Order. After listening, Dalen said that he would help. The representative of the Sacred Knights offered another bag of gold coins as an advance, to which the mercenary refused, saying that the gifted relic would be more than enough. Tavern Crow's Nest. Beaumark came to Siena in order to deliver some news to the mercenary as soon as he returns. He didn't even expect to speak with him in person, but that day, luck was on his side. Dalen stood in the doorway. He was glad to see his friends. Siena noticed a chest behind Dalen, as he was just about to instruct her to find someone who could open the chest within 4 days. The hero turned to the owner of the trading company so that he would tell him why he had come. But Siena stepped in. She said that she had been working hard on the assignment to select tasks regarding elixirs, rituals, and spells that could increase physical strength. There wasn't much progress. Most of them were impossible to obtain or had severe side effects. That's why she began to study herbs. Focusing on merchants and cultivators, that's when Beaumark turned up. The owner of the trading company continued, asking if our hero knew the little town of Lebok, to which he replied affirmatively. The fact was that near this town, dozens of mandragora colonies were discovered, the legendary plant capable of increasing both magic and endurance. However, at the same time, its scream could stop a man's heart. Dalen was intrigued. He asked if it was true or just a rumor. He received the answer that this information could very well be just a rumor, but it's better to check everything personally, as Beaumark intended to take care of that. Dalen thought that it appeared the Ashen Witch had begun to carry out her plans. Lebok was located in the southwestern part of the continent, in the same direction as the chasm where the Order of Sacred Knights is located. Decision made. Dalen will set off with the owner of the trading company. We are in the Bronze District in the Empire of the Gallia Trading Company. In the middle of the yard stands Beaumark Gallia himself, fighting off the consequences of yesterday's drinking. Despite this, preparations for the trip were in full swing. Behind him, a familiar voice of a mercenary greeted him. He wasn't alone. He was in the company of Lucia. Dalen introduced the present characters and explained that they were all headed in the same direction. Gallia was very pleased with such companions. For him, it was an honor. Just think, he'd be accompanied not only by the mercenary, who tore a goblin apart with his bare hands and saved the entire Bronze District from heretics, but also by the very student of the Order of Sacred Knights. After clarifying what time the departure was, Dalen said that he still had some other matters to attend to. Adventurers who defeated the demon of the underground labyrinth and brought with them its essence can earn a huge reward. The place to obtain it was not far from the trading company. At the office of Labyrinth Management of the Silver District, he was greeted by a girl who led him to a man named Evan. And there was another reason why he had come to the office. It was a meeting with one of the transcendents of the Diamond Palace. Evan invited the mercenary into his office, offered his guest tea, and sat opposite him. He emphasized that defeating a demon on the first visit to the labyrinth was a very impressive event, to which Dalen replied that it was merely a stroke of luck. And he thought to himself that that luck was still with him. Since Evan was indeed a transcendent, he had already met him. But back then he was in another guise. He didn't recognize him until it was too late, since he looked different from his appearance in the game, endlessly changing his appearance. Leveron a Hakim. Essentially, he is an army of one. The mercenary had a plan to earn his trust and create the opportunity to make him his ally. There was one way to subtly hint at exposing his identity. At first, it wasn't going very well for Dalen. But by the end of their conversation, he managed to diffuse the situation and pique the interest of the person. Our characters set off on their journey, with Dalen riding in the same carriage with Lucia. He managed to secure a decent reward for the demon's essence. Plus, the items retrieved from the chest held a decent place. A youth approached the carriage window from the outside. On Gallia's orders, he inquired if the trip was comfortable. The mercenary replied. That kid reminded him of the old days. Dalen asked his name, and the young mercenary introduced himself. He was called Perun. He explained that at the moment he doesn't have a rank yet, since he's only on his third assignment. Our character encouraged the youth, saying that he'd make it. Lucia smiled, then said that she hadn't expected such a kind gesture from Dalen, because she thought the mercenary was a maniac, completely and utterly obsessed with missions. Our character muttered that it was rude, although he stretched a smile on his face. There was a noise from outside. It was an orc attack. Lucia said that it would be quite surprising if any of their journeys went by without some trouble. 2 system windows notified the mercenary about the body collection. Dalen rushed into battle, leading the attack. In a few moments, he severed all the limbs of the monsters. It was quick and spectacular, but very exhausting. He could have stretched the pleasure a bit longer and not used so much energy. From behind, one of the orcs sneaked up on the hunter and was already preparing to strike, when at that moment his body was pierced through by a sword. When the creature fell to the ground, Dalen saw Perun behind it. He turned out to be quite good in battle. The mercenary thanked him and went on to take down the rest of the bad guys. The skirmish was over, and Perun and Lucia were making their way through the goblin corpses. The boy expressed his admiration for the Lady Knight's fighting style. The girl praised him, saying that he also handled weapons well, and if he kept training hard, he would achieve good results. The young mercenary asked where the orcs could have come from, since their habitat is in the northeast, in the jagged mountains. Lucia suggested that perhaps they had been driven out in a power struggle. Considering the increased monster activity lately, it seemed there were no more places left in the mountains. Upon hearing their conversation, Dalen also fell into thought, comparing the current events with how things were in the game. This was exactly the time when the first stage of the monster invasion began. At this time, monsters across the continent began to behave more actively. But the first invasion wasn't large enough for the orcs to lose their base. The mercenary looted 2 of his corpses, increasing his sensitivity, intelligence, and mana by 1 point each. A new skill appeared, Thunderbolt. Lucia called out to him. She was already in the carriage and told him they were continuing their journey. Upon arriving at their destination, our heroes noticed that there were many people in the city, which was unusual for this place. This was mainly because rumors about mandrakes had spread. Gallia asked where the travelers were headed next, to which Dalen replied that they would stay in Lebok for a few days. Cutting through the city street, Lucia asked why Dalen decided to join this trip, to which he responded with a question, asking if she knew anything about witches. The student of the Holy Knights replied that she hadn't personally met any, but she had heard about them in her lessons, something along the lines of that due to their lineage they possess power comparable to archmages, and many people chase them, mostly those who fear their incredible power. Dalen listened and then confirmed the above information, stating that one of the witches was indeed here, and she harbored much more hatred for humans than the others. His companion immediately understood what this meant and asked if the witch was connected to the mandrake colonies. Dalen explained that while mandrake was a medicinal plant, if hundreds of roots were pulled at once, it could cause significant harm to the city. Lucia was ready to go and resist the evil, but the mercenary wasn't in such a hurry since he already had a plan. They went to a hut located on the outskirts of the city, a rather depressing place. As far as the mercenary knew, the Ashen Witch was preparing a powerful ritual, and for its execution she needed people for sacrifice. He knocked on the door, and an unpleasant male voice came from behind it. The man on the other side asked what brought our heroes here. Dalen told a legend, explaining that he knew an old woman who predicted the future lived here, and he wanted to ask for her help. The man opened the door, and his face was far uglier than his voice. He said the travelers had come to the right place and invited them inside. The mercenary instantly assessed the situation and counted the witch's followers, with whom it was more than likely he'd have to fight soon. Dalen announced that he was in a hurry and didn't plan to stay long, and that he'd like to receive a prediction from the old woman as quickly as possible, to which he was told that the witch wasn't there, that she was preparing for a great purpose and needed sacrifices. and it was quite convenient that the candidates for such a fate had come to her lair themselves. Our heroes had been waiting for this turn of events. Lucia threw off her cloak. The witch's minions were furious at the presence of a holy knight in their evil lair. They rushed at her, shouting about swiftly dealing with the girl, to which Dalen just smirked and charged, ready to punish the scoundrels. In principle, everything ended pretty quickly. The room was littered with 7 lifeless bodies of the 8 minions who had been present before. To find out where the Ashen Witch was, our hero extended the ugly man's life just a little. Dylan and Lucia headed toward the pitiful minion of evil. The mercenary felt they had stepped into the witch's barrier. As demonic mana began to thicken, meaning the old woman must be nearby, the mercenary stopped. The holy sword on his back shuddered lightly. The girl objected, saying it couldn't be. The sword should have lost all its divine power. On their path, they saw a massive cage filled with people, their life force seemingly drained. Some were missing limbs and others had only one eye. Lucia, taking a closer look, saw among the prisoners Parun! She wanted to rush to his aid, but Dalen stopped her, saying he needed a second to think. That it wasn't so simple. The witch was right here. And in an instant, a jagged crack appeared in the air in the center of the glade, from which billowed purple smoke, twisting like living creatures. First came the creaky laughter. Then from the darkness emerged a tall silhouette. The smoke parted and the witch appeared, her eyes glowing with magical fire, her long gray hair flowing, and the dark cloak seemed sewn from the very night. The witch addressed her minion, asking how our heroes had managed to enter her territory, saying they didn't look like those who could easily become sacrifices. To which he began screaming that he didn't want this at all and begged for mercy. The witch said that disobedient children must be punished, and then struck her minion with a powerful surge of magic. The witch had not yet turned her attention to our heroes. When Dalen threw an axe straight at her face, knowing that it wouldn't kill her, but he demanded that she reveal her true form. The witch simply laughed and summoned 2 demonic wolf-like creatures, introducing them as hellish nightmares. The mercenary asked his companion if she could handle such a task, to which she replied that it was worth trying. Dalen activated the skill Leap and nimbly jumped over the demonic creatures and got closer to the sorceress. She continued to shower the hero with frightening words and threw blazing spheres at him, but the mercenary skillfully dodged. 4 windows about looting corpses popped up. The demoness shed her old woman guise and summoned the spirit of Anaxagus, calling on his promised power. Dalen used the skill Crushing Sword of Lapentella and prepared to strike. This time the opponent was strong enough, which in principle made sense given the number of corpses. She began mocking the mercenary, wondering why he had stopped using the power of the territory. Indeed, his stamina was running low, and even if he could use the territory, only once, but he needed to pick the right moment. The sorceress screamed that she would gladly sacrifice Dalen and his companion in the name of the great cause, and then incinerate all the inhabitants of Lebok. To which the mercenary replied that he had heard of all the humiliations she had suffered at the hands of people. But even so, the witch's methods were too cruel. Whether it was revenge or something else, there would never be forgiveness for what she had done. Therefore, the mercenary was doing the demoness a favor, so she would pay for her sins with death. The demoness screamed in fury, saying that he knew nothing about witches and their hard fate. Though centuries had passed, she had never forgotten how people afraid of this power hunted her family and cruelly suppressed them. The sorceress used almost all of her demonic mana, turning it into discs and launching them at her opponent. Dalen deflected all the discs with the sword of La Pantella. Afterward, it seemed to him that the witch had disappeared, but she was sitting on the ground, breathing heavily. In her emotional state, she miscalculated her stamina and used up almost all her strength, so she decided to resort to something she hadn't planned to use. With one wave of her hand, she awakened the mandragores, ripping them from the earth. The scream was deafening. The mercenary began coughing up blood. His body seemed paralyzed. Seeing this, the Ashen Witch soared into the air and covered her opponent with a crushing dome made of the remaining energy. The battle was over, and in the demoness's opinion, she was already about to disappear from sight when she was called out. It was him, the invincible gold-ranked mercenary, Dalen. Her astonishment knew no bounds, and probably not so much because he was still alive, but because he held the sacred sword in his hands. Dalen explained that he hadn't been mistaken when he thought the sword was vibrating. When the witch used mana, he felt it again. The witch objected, saying that only the chosen ones of the god of war could wield the sacred sword. To which Dalen replied that apparently the god had unexpectedly chosen him, and under these circumstances even he wanted the death of the Ashen Witch. The mercenary called the sorceress to attack, which she did. She launched an attack with green ash, one of the qualities the Ashen Witch was born with. It was so hot that it could scorch skin with the slightest touch. However, the holy sword had two abilities. The first, its outstanding wear resistance. The second, enhancement of the wielder's abilities. Dalen used the skill Thunderbolt, and it was 1,000 times more powerful than its original form. With this, the mercenary stopped the witch's ashen curse with a single strike, and she was stunned. The sorceress writhed in convulsions from the lightning's effect. After regaining her composure, she decided to carry out her plan and also use it against the hunter. She exclaimed that over 2,000 mandrakes grew in the vicinity of the forest, and the spell to activate them could be applied in two cases. The first, if she herself uttered it. The second, if she died, it would trigger automatically. Dalen noticed that mandrakes were sensitive to their habitat. The witch realized what he was hinting at. The mercenary exclaimed that he would burn this forest down. After all, he had a skill suited for this situation, one he obtained after defeating the devil of the Labyrinth, namely Hegalius's firestorm. Dalen cast the spell, and once again, the witch was stunned, because this was the spell of the master of the magical tower Ignel from the past generation. A mesmerizing and terrifying spectacle unfolded. Thanks to the skill Dragon's Blood Resurrection, Dalen's body remained unharmed, though he lost his clothes. Gasping for breath, the dying witch expressed her surprise that the mercenary knew not only the spell, but also possessed the immortal blood of a dragon. These were her last words. Dalen thought that all of his dying enemies had rather unoriginal last words. Just then, Lucia arrived, stunned by the sight of the mercenary, and asked him to cover himself immediately. 2 days passed since the death of the Ashen Witch. Fortunately, our hero had previously managed to farm some gold, thanks to which he was able to buy himself decent attire. The mandrakes were burned to ashes. The merchants, who had no more reasons to stay, left the city. Dalen came to the inn, and in the room by the bed was Lucia, with Perun lying unconscious. He was the only one who survived among the people who had been in the cage. Dalen asked the girl to take care of the young man, and he went to the forest. After all, he hadn't had the chance to loot the bodies. Lucia, seeing his appearance, quickly pulled him out of there. Dalen walked through what had recently been a forest. He regretted that it had come to this, but there was no other way to get rid of all the mandrakes at once. A picture of the crying bull mark flashed in his mind. Because so much money could have been made from the roots of these plants, the mercenary had just found the bodies. Nothing special fell from the first and second ones. Some abilities increased by 1 stat. From the third body, he got the skill Curse Prevention Seal. Dalen thought it would be useful in battles with dark mages. There was only 1 body left. From it fell a dagger, Dark Moon's Spellbreaker. It would be useful in combat against imperfect spells, as it would destroy them. And if the spells were strong enough, he could counterattack with a sword strike. This was the first time this had happened. Items hadn't dropped from bodies before. The mercenary was intrigued by what might drop from the next bodies. When Dalen was about to leave, he noticed something. It was a flower sticking out of the ashes. Surprisingly, albeit rare, some bushes of the plant had managed to survive. Dalen returned to the city and decided to visit the tavern. Sitting with a mug of beer, he pondered that his visit to Lebok had borne fruit. He had managed to collect 4 bodies and even found an item, and the most important achievement, using the holy sword. But the representative of the leadership of the Order of Sacred Knights had said that the sword had completely lost its divine power. So why did it tremble? Could it be that the god of war had chosen him? Dalen's thoughts were interrupted by Gali, who had also wandered into the tavern for a mug of beer. The hunter asked why he hadn't left yet, to which Gali replied that his trading company was large enough, and preparations for departure took a lot of time. Gali asked if Perun had regained consciousness. Upon receiving an answer, he took a small pouch of coins from his jacket and entrusted the mercenary to give the compensation to the boy, to which our hero joked, saying that the owner of the trading company was kinder than he thought. During their conversation, the hunter learned something shocking for himself, namely that the dead on the northern borders had started rising from their graves. Dalen asked him to repeat what he had just heard. Gali told him not to worry so much, that it could just be rumors. And his source, well, here it is, in the north of the empire, in a place called Langleton Village. Pagan cultists were spotted, warning that the end is near, and urging people to build altars and start praying that he will rise soon. After that, strange things started happening at night. Corpses made only of bones rose from their graves. They wandered through the surroundings and managed to get into the village. Dalen understood that this was the work of a necromancer. And if there was talk of a descent, there was no doubt it referred to the immortal devil, who would soon awaken from his seal. The mercenary began to wonder if the devil was really immortal, and whether he was under a seal, because he could only be stopped that way. There had to be some loophole, and it seemed like he had come up with something. Gally asked if his companion had any ideas about what was going on there. Dalen smiled, reassuring the trading company owner that it was probably just a rumor after all. The mercenary returned to the inn, his head boiling with thoughts. It was enough that he was busy transporting the holy sword. Now there was more trouble. First, the Ashen Witch had caused trouble. Now the immortal devil had appeared. The voice of Perun brought him back to reality, claiming that the travelers must take him with them, to which Lucia insisted that they weren't going for a break, but for a serious mission. And if something goes wrong, the young man might lose his life, as he was quite weak. She wasn't very successful in convincing him. Dalen thought about whether it was really worth it to take the young mercenary and increase the risks. The road they would follow to deliver the sword was incredibly difficult. Also, one shouldn't forget about the traitor among the knights. However, looking into the young man's eyes, he already had a decision. He asked if he knew how to pack a supplies bag, to which the young man responded affirmatively. The next question was about his skills in setting up camp, to which Perun replied that he could do it, maybe not quickly, but he had the skill. Dalen reassured the boy that he would hire him as a porter and a mercenary. Perun's joy knew no bounds. Lucia asked if this was a good idea, to which Dalen replied that everything would be fine, handing the boy a root of the surviving mandrake. Then he gave the young mercenary advice to get a good meal before the journey. The travelers set off on their journey, riding horses, and they had already been on the road for several days. Dalen rode by himself while Perun rode with Lucia. His condition wasn't great. He was in a semi-conscious state and was sweating often, to which the girl suggested that they set up camp and rest for a bit. They began searching for a suitable spot for the tent. Despite the circumstances, Lucia told the mercenary that she was glad he allowed Perun to come with them. Dalen said that he wasn't such a cold-blooded bastard, to which the girl laughed. During their journey, Lucia taught the persistent boy the art of sword fighting, and he was quite good at it. The girl shared her plans with the mercenary, that once they arrived at the main headquarters of the order, she planned to offer Perun the chance to become a holy knight. Dalen agreed that it was a good idea. The hunter and the holy knight both sensed a faint smell of blood and began to follow it. They approached an inn, and by mutual decision, they left Perun outside. As they entered, the smell became much stronger. They were greeted by a young woman who at first seemed friendly, but our heroes knew that behind that smile, something awful was hiding. The girl asked how many people were planning to stay the night. Dalen replied that there were 3 of them and requested 2 rooms and meals. The innkeeper stepped away. The mercenary knew that under the guise of hospitality, something terrible was going on here. But who exactly the girl was remained to be discovered. The innkeeper returned asking if Lucia needed anything, to which she requested a bath be prepared for her before dinner. Dalen sent his companion to take a bath while he went back for Perun. The mercenary and his assistant sat at the table, and the suspicious girl served them food. Our hero decided to strike up a conversation with the innkeeper. He asked why there were no other guests in the inn. She replied that there had been few visitors in the past month. The girl asked if the travelers had heard anything about this place. The mercenary responded that he had heard of walking corpses. The innkeeper laughed, saying she had never heard of such stories. The mercenary's assistant asked if the girl was from the Empire. She pretended not to understand the question. Then Perun explained that he was from there too and recognized her accent. The suspicious woman admitted that she had grown up there, but hadn't been back for a long time. Perun continued, saying that his accent faded a year after he left, but hers was still noticeable after all this time. He asked how that was possible. The innkeeper tensed. Dalen noted that his assistant was quite a sharp young man. That was the moment to voice their suspicions. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the second floor. Moments later, several men tumbled down the stairs, with Lucia following behind, armed and ready. The girl explained that these bastards had attacked her as soon as she entered the bath. Dalen turned toward the innkeeper and demanded an explanation. She replied that her plan had been to quietly eat them, but given the circumstances, there was no avoiding the noise. The girl then shouted a spell, and immediately the dead appeared from all sides. Now Dalen understood that she was the necromancer the rumors had spoken of. Haroon, on his part, decided to smash the skull of one of the undead, but it had no effect on the advancing foe. The crazed innkeeper laughed, declaring that the dead couldn't die, and that she would wait until the guests grew tired and surrendered. Then she would eat them. The mercenary mentally confirmed her words. Indeed, the undead couldn't die, but he had the Spellbreaker blade, a weapon capable of severing their existence. The girl cried out in disbelief that the hunter had managed to stop her spell. The blade could destroy most spells with a single touch, and even small cuts from it could place a fatal curse on the caster. At that moment, Perun was struggling with one of the undead, having been knocked to the ground. Lucia seemed to want to help, but he refused, arguing that he could handle one skeletal creature on his own. In that instant, the blade took effect, and the skeleton collapsed lifelessly on top of the young man. Lucia thought the spellcaster had died, but now Perun screamed for help. Perun screamed for Lucia to help him get out from under the heavy weight, but the innkeeper was still alive and had no intention of stopping the fight. She said that the skeletons could still be resurrected. The mercenary thought that the necromancer's actions had some higher purpose, perhaps preparing victims for the immortal devil, but it turned out that cannibalism was just her usual hobby. Dalen stabbed the necromancer's hand with his blade. Lucia arrived and told Dalen that there were people hiding in the basement, who revealed that the seal on the immortal devil had already been broken. The mercenary listened and told her and Perun to stay at the inn. He said they would continue their journey the next morning. He then set off on his own business. Dalen had a plan for how to restrain the immortal devil if it couldn't be killed. He had something that could help him use the creature's power for his own purposes. We are shown events that took place 300 years ago. A creature spreading all sorts of curses made the world freeze in terror. Even though the knights attacked it with all their might, their efforts were in vain due to the devil's immortality. The only thing they could do was seal it away with divine power. Dalen snuck into the cave where all this had taken place. At the entrance, he saw cultists leading villagers inside, likely destined to be sacrifices. Dalen threw a stone at one of the minions of evil, then ambushed them from above, jumping off the slope and neutralizing another enemy. The villagers were grateful for this turn of events. Help soon arrived for the cultists, but this wasn't a problem for the mercenary. He destroyed them one by one using the armor-fighting technique skill. Only one remained. Dalen threw a dagger into his hand, causing him to retreat. The hunter chased after him, likely thinking the cultist would lead him where he needed to go. A system window popped up, informing him that his mastery of the armor-fighting technique had increased to 99%. Inside the cave, a ritual was underway, with several cultists worshipping the immortal devil and eagerly awaiting people for sacrifice. But instead, their bloodied comrade rushed in shouting that everything had been ruined, that all the brothers outside had been killed, and the people had scattered. And it was all because of one man who appeared out of nowhere. The devil was enraged by what he heard. He was disappointed that he had trusted people. As punishment, he ate those who had just worshipped him. Dalen entered, thanking the devil for making his task easier. For now, he wouldn't have to deal with the small fry. The immortal devil was surprised that the man who dared to interrupt the sacrifice had come to him and moreover was carrying a divine sword. Though he hardly resembled a holy knight, the mercenary prepared to attack, invoking the power of the territory, which also impressed the demon. In response, the devil cast the curse of the mist of death. Anything that touched it would be melted. Dalen used the curse prevention seal skill, but unfortunately it didn't help, as it only protected against lesser curses. The devil hurled the mercenary into the wall so hard that the holy sword flew out of his hands. Our hero used the dragon blood revival skill and thought, it would be really useful if there were a barrier strong enough to contain the curse. Later, the armor fighting technique skill came into play, and the system notified that the skill had been maxed out to 100%. Then an idea occurred to the mercenary. He thought about using the territory's power with this skill. Since armored combat involves wearing armor, it might be worth trying to use the territory as armor. While the hunter was formulating his plan, the devil sent a stream of scorching flame his way, deciding not to stretch the enjoyment and simply burn the opponent. But nothing happened. Dalen's body burned, but the fire didn't cause him any harm. Now he was ready for the attack. The devil attempted to retreat into the subspace and wait for a moment, when the mercenary would lower his guard to strike, but he didn't manage to do so. Dalen, using the power of the territory, increased his size to match that of the devil, and began to pummel him with powerful blows in close combat. It wasn't easy for him, however, as he started to shrink in size, and after a while he took the form of an innocent creature and began begging for mercy. But the mercenary knew this was just a trick. His current size allowed him to execute his plans with the Hallman chain, as the main condition for using the relic was that the opponent must be incapable of resisting. Dallin commanded the demon to call him master. The demon responded that it was his fate. Lucia and Perun awaited Dallin in the morning at the inn. The girl had already started to worry about his prolonged absence. But then the mercenary's assistant spotted a silhouette among the trees. It was indeed Dallin, and in his hands something dangled on a rope, like a balloon. Lucia addressed him, asking if it was really what she thought it was. The mercenary nodded in satisfaction and introduced the mighty immortal devil to his friends. He even gave him a name, Arbor. The girl and the boy were simply thrilled by the sight. They continued their journey with Perun playing with the demon like a plush toy all the way, clearly displeasing the demon. Lucia asked how Dallin had thought of such a thing, as even holy knights wouldn't have come up with it, to which they locked him in a remote cave. The mercenary disagreed, saying they had likely thought of it, but since the relic had been lost, they couldn't carry it out. The girl remarked that the mercenary knew an oddly large amount compared to his usual behavior. Dallin wondered what his usual behavior was. At that moment, Perun noticed something and pointed toward it. It was an intermediate checkpoint in the kingdom of Noria. That was where the travelers were headed. As they approached the main gates, the mercenary noticed that security checks had become more stringent, with baggage being inspected for newcomers. Something had to be done, as certain items might raise questions. Dallin turned to his new charge and asked him to use subspace and hide certain items there. The devilish creature replied that his mana level was at rock bottom, so he could only open it through a fixed path, namely through his mouth. They approached the guard, and the mercenary presented his gold rank badge. The guard asked where they were from and the purpose of their visit, to which Dallin told the legend that they were traveling from Lebok to the headquarters of the Holy Knights, so that his cousin could join their ranks. The guard apologized for the inconvenience, explaining that the security measures were due to rumors of a necromancer. Behind them a noise was heard. A rider mounted on a horse approached, and upon closer inspection, our heroes recognized him as a holy knight. The guard shouted for him to stop and dismount, as they were now entering imperial territory. The rider declared that he was an envoy and approached Lucia. He told her that the commander had ordered her group to flee, as there had been a split among the knights. A civil war had broken out. The envoy continued his story. The days when members of the order traveled across the continent, making their name, were gone. Now the Holy Knights only remained in a small kingdom on the border, all because of the pitiful greed of the Knight Commander, who sought to seize power. Dallin knew this was bound to happen. Just like the Ashen Witch, he had been the bitter enemy of the Knight Commander since the middle of the game. The Deputy Commander of the Holy Knights, Everlock Glaston. The mercenary had planned to deal with him upon arriving at the headquarters, but he hadn't expected him to start a civil conflict already. The end was coming quickly. Spreading discord within the Holy Knights, a stable organization, would have been impossible. That's why he had conspired with the Ashen Witch. But after the alliance was formed, she perished. Perhaps he felt cornered and decided to take his last step. Dallin and Lucia sat by the campfire. The girl was downcast, and she suggested that the mercenary complete the mission, as she didn't want to involve him in the trouble. Dallin disagreed, arguing that the Holy Sword had chosen him. He had lost his sacred powers, but regained them in its hands, and that meant the gods themselves had chosen him. He asked the girl, if this wasn't just an excuse to get involved in the internal war of the Holy Knights. Dallin thought to himself that he needed the sacred power to stand against all the higher evil, and to obtain this power he had to loot the best corpse that lay in the crevice. And he could only get there after the conflict within the Knights was resolved. The mercenary sent the girl to sleep so she could rest. Dallin thought about how he had increasingly brushed against the ominous god Anaxagus. He was the craftiest of the 5 hellish gods. From the subspace, Arbor emerged and proudly declared that he was born in the pit of Anaxagus in Cauldron. Dallin wasn't expecting his appearance and scolded him for appearing without permission. At that moment, the mercenary sensed something, as if they were being watched and an ambush was preparing. But Dallin seemed to vanish from his previous position. He was already scattering the troublemakers with the Holy Sword. One of them exclaimed that he dared not hold the Holy Sword, to which the mercenary replied, "In the name of honor." Revolver bullets whizzed through the air, and the hunter skillfully deflected them. Dallin snatched an axe out of the air, which had been aimed at him. This blow had come from the last man. He needed to deal with him before he could flee. If even one survivor returned to the deputy commander, the next ambush would be more sophisticated and cunning. Dalen managed to throw an axe at him, which struck but didn't kill. Approaching closer, he asked if the man had been sent by the deputy commander. The false knight responded with a shout, wondering how the mercenary knew this. Dalen replied that it was a dirty move, something in the deputy commander's style. The man grabbed his revolver and shot point blank at Dalen. The mercenary, using the dragon's blood revival skill, struck the false knight down. Regaining consciousness, Dalen heard some rustling behind him, and instantly threw a dagger in that direction. It missed, deflected by a sword. It was a man, his silhouette barely visible for now. The man apologized to Dalen, explaining that he hadn't meant to scare him. He raised his blade and stepped closer. He explained that he had heard the deputy commander wanted the holy sword and had sent one of his special unit teams. He had rushed to help but arrived just a little too late. Dalen took the blade in his hands and said that the man had arrived just in time. The man extended his hand and said that it was a pleasure to meet someone chosen by the gods themselves. The man turned out to be the commander of the Holy Knights, Edgar the Lionheart. The next day, the travelers continued on their way, now with more people. Edgar joined them, and Perun had the honor of riding alongside him. The boy wouldn't stop talking, bombarding the commander with questions. One of them was about whether it was true that Edgar could see the future. The Supreme Knight answered that he indeed had the eye gift, given by the god of war, which allowed him to glimpse into the future. This helped them to fight monsters that attacked the Holy Knights. But it wasn't always accurate. If it had been perfect, he could have prevented the schism within the Knights. The next question came from Lucia. She asked if the commander knew they were coming to him. He replied that the gods had shown him how the Holy Knight, the young swordsman, and the mercenary crossed the border into the kingdom of Noria. Next scene, we're in Edgar's office. The commander is at the negotiation table with Dalen. Edgar emphasized that to resolve the internal conflict among the knights, immediate action was required. The mercenary asked if he would go alone on the mission, to which Edgar replied that he would be accompanied by the Holy Knight Lucia and a mage who would assist the order. At that moment, the mage appeared. It turned out to be none other than the elder mage from Falchion, now accompanied by his apprentice, who had become an even more respected mage since their last meeting. They were happy to see each other, and the chance to work together again was even better. The Supreme Mage explained how he had come to be here, and it went like this. The barrier on the mountain range surrounding the chasm and the headquarters of the Holy Knights had been created by the first master of the magical tower, Elgaia, Jenga Elgaia, one of the first mages of the land. This happened around 1200 years ago. He arrived here to study the magic used to create this barrier. There was a creak of the door, and Lucia entered, accompanied by two other Holy Knights, who looked almost identical to each other, though the plot didn't reveal whether they were brothers or not, but it seemed likely. Now everyone was present. It was time to discuss the plan in detail. The commander-in-chief explained that his deputy, along with the special squad, had attacked from all sides, using the third sanctuary as their base. The damage inflicted had been significant. They managed to capture one member of the special squad, who had attacked the supply group. After interrogation, it became clear that the Holy Knights and the special squad, who had participated in the rebellion, were under the influence of a curse. Based on assumptions, it was either the witch or the dragon from the chasm who were involved. But since Dalen knew the Ashen Witch had been neutralized, only the dragon remained. To destroy the source of the curse, they needed to enter the underground ruins. Looking at the map, the Elder Mage noticed that it was a rune map from the ancient dynasty of sandstorms. This meant it was quite old, and not many knights were familiar with it. Edgar continued, saying that based on the information they had, the source was deep inside the third sanctuary's vault. While the group, led by the mercenary, would carry out the plan, the commander-in-chief would take on the distracting task from the outside. Entering the ruins, Dalen remembered past times. When he had been here, behind the screen of his computer, somewhere in these ruins was one of his corpses, which he needed to find. He also thought that this was a great place for the immortal devil to become stronger, as it would be a waste to use such a powerful being as a pocket with subspace. He just needed to find the right moment to sneak away briefly. Ahead, the brothers were arguing over where to turn, and the mercenary began to doubt whether they could trust the map. Out of subspace, Arbor appeared again. He still needed some practice with his appearance. He expressed confusion, asking why there were no traps in these sandstorm ruins. There was something off about this, but Dalen gave his subordinate a stern look. At that moment, the ruins began to shake. The mercenary, as if scanning the wall with his gaze, figured out what was happening. From the darkness came a whistle. Crossbow bolts were flying toward the group in droves. The mercenary began deflecting them with his sword, and one of them he caught with his hand right in front of Lucia's face. He shouted for everyone to run as fast as possible. The heroes ran through the labyrinthine ruins for a long time, but no matter where they turned, a new trap awaited them. Lucia asked Sir Houston how much farther they had to run. He replied that he had no idea, as the map didn't mark areas with traps. But Dalen suspected that the map was leading them along the path where the traps were located. Arbor peeked out from subspace again, whining that this was not what he meant when he mentioned the traps. The mercenary asked if Arbor knew anything about these ruins. The subordinate revealed that there was a guardian of the ruins who controlled all the ambushes. He used the altar magic of souls, which trapped souls inside buildings or statues. The traps wouldn't stop until those who had invaded the building were destroyed. The mercenary shouted for the group to keep running without stopping, and he would try to do something about it. The elder mage noticed how much stronger his territory had become in such a short time. Arbor was pointing the way for his master. Traps were everywhere, but Dalen skillfully dodged them, advancing forward. Finally, they managed to find the entrance to the king's tomb. Before entering, the mercenary used the skill Curse Prevention Seal. There he was greeted by Kashan, the guardian of the ruins and the king. He cast a curse, summoning the dead and ordered them to send the guest to eternal sleep. But the skill did its job, and the curse's power did not affect our hero. However, the magic was still strong enough, so the mercenary understood the seal wouldn't hold for long. The options were either to succumb to the curse or destroy the nasty skeleton. The guardian of the ruins cast stronger magic. Arbor, in his master's defense, emerged and absorbed the effects of all the curses into his space. This allowed the mercenary to decapitate the guardian without interference. There was still one powerful curse left in the vessel containing the king's soul. A prompt appeared, asking to select the corpse. Dalen remembered the circumstances of that death. When he fought with the guardian of the ruins, it seemed like victory was his, but the dark creature had consumed the contents of the vessel and exacted revenge on him. Our hero grabbed his subordinate and shoved him into the vessel, so that Arbor could absorb its contents. Thus, the mercenary had enslaved the forces of evil twice for his own gain. He had looted the corpse, enhancing his strength and sensitivity in one stat, and his mastery by 2. A new skill appeared, Sword of Rirodanopi, a B-rank skill with a magical characteristic. Additionally, there was a pleasant bonus item, Fragment of the Left Eye of the Seeker. If focused mentally on a target, this object would track its location. Our hero figured his comrades must have already reached the core of the curse. There were no more traps, so he could go to them without worrying. The little devil became stronger and even began to believe in himself, giving Dalen a threat-filled look, only to receive a slap on the head and obediently follow his master. The rest of the group did indeed manage to reach the curse's source, but things weren't going so smoothly. The special group members were guarding it, and Lucia took them on, while the brothers unsuccessfully tried to disable the stone supplying the curse. Then in front of the female knight, a tall opponent appeared, who prepared to strike with an axe, but was neutralized by the mage's apprentice with a spell. Suddenly, through the dust column, a figure of a traitorous knight appeared. Everlock himself had come to the ruins to assess the situation taking place there. Lucia greeted him with a couple of curses, to which he replied that she wasn't taught how to treat her elders like that. Their swords crossed. The opponent began to press on the painful subject, saying that he had witnessed the scene of her battle with a companion, someone very dear to her, and how she had killed him with her own hands. The girl furiously asked how he knew this. Everlock explained that the devil of the cave had merely been a chess piece, but he lacked the strength. And to fix that, a holy knight with a holy sword had been sent to him. No one could have ever imagined that an apprentice knight would be the one to kill him. Just then, Dalen arrived, and with his holy sword, he deflected the next strike aimed at Lucia. Arbor, sensing the curse, immediately crawled out of his hiding place and devoured the stone with great appetite. The curse's effects ceased to affect Everlock's allies. The traitor knight was outraged, asking why the holy sword was in the hands of a barbarian, to which Dalen replied that if he had an issue with it, he should try to take it. He had been ready for such a turn of events, but someone spoke from behind him. An unknown figure addressed the false knight, saying that even after Chongren granted him power, he still couldn't deal with regular people. And if Chongren hadn't struck a deal with Anaxagus through the witch, he wouldn't even be here. Lucia addressed the stranger, telling him to reveal his identity, and if he didn't, for his unlawful intrusion onto the Sacred Knight's territory, he would lose his life. The stranger removed his cloak's hood, but definitely not because he was scared of the Lady Knight's words, but rather to instill even more fear with his appearance. Dalen pushed the girl aside, saying that she wasn't strong enough yet to face this opponent. It was a wyvern with blue scales, a dragon from the rift. Let's now observe the events that unfolded outside. The commander-in-chief and the Sacred Knights were fighting alongside the rebels. In an instant, all their opponents seemed to lose consciousness and collapse to the ground. He realized that this could only happen in one case: if the mercenary had managed to neutralize the curse's core. Lately, he had often dreamed of monsters attacking the rift, and he feared that the internal war would begin simultaneously with these events. At this moment, his thoughts were interrupted by the trembling of the ground. He immediately ordered everyone to be on alert to fight a high-rank monster. The shaking of the earth intensified, and in a moment, the third sanctuary shattered into pieces. And from beneath the earth, a gigantic blue dragon flew out. And behind it, like an arrow, came the one chosen by the gods. It sliced through the air with the holy sword, trying to strike the beast. But the dragon struck the mercenary with a stream of ominous energy that it was spewing from its mouth. Dellen was flying toward the ground, realizing that there was no suitable place beneath him where he could land. But just in time, a system window appeared, notifying him that the leap skill had been upgraded to 100% and was ready for territory power. He didn't even wait for the landing moment, but pushed off the wind, using it as support for another jump, delivering such a powerful blow to the dragon that it crashed to the ground with a thud. The mercenary, seizing the moment, began to strike the dragon with his holy sword while it was disoriented. But the wyvern quickly recovered and flew back up, and decided to resort to the power of the curse. But the mercenary had a seal for such an occasion, which deprived the dragon of its ability to affect the curse. Left powerless, the dragon apparently wanted to escape and recover. But then to our hero's aid came the commander-in-chief, who summoned divine power and created a massive dome-shaped shield. The dragon was uttering various curses. Here was the opportunity to try the skill Sword of Rednary. After launching the blade, the mercenary rushed toward the hovering creature. From its mouth, blue flames shot out. The fire caused no harm to our hero, and on the contrary allowed him to sneak closer and land a crushing blow. A window appeared for looting the corpse. On the ground lay the beheaded body of the dragon. The knights were collecting their injured comrades. The commander was stunned by the mercenary's achievement. He was even more impressed that Dalen possessed the skill of dragon's blood, specifically from the fire dragon, which not everyone could adapt to. The commander-in-chief thanked the hunter and, giving orders to the knights, disappeared. Dalen thought about how this had been a tough battle. He had almost died. He approached the corpse and looted it, gaining strength, skill, and mana for 1 stat each. But that wasn't the only corpse he found. He also found another thief trying to rob the Sacred Knight's armory. Yes, our character has such a criminal past. The mercenary began looting it, his skill increased by 1 stat, and a rather decent item dropped: an invisibility cloak. There was still something else to do. He approached the dragon's carcass, plunged his sword into it, making an incision, then reached in and pulled out its heart. He handed the trophy to his subordinate and said that the latter was responsible for the heart with his life. Arbor was outraged that he was still called the Immortal Devil, and he apparently had to carry the heart of some lizard. Dalen grumbled for him to shut up. The mercenary crouched, leaning on the dragon, and replayed the recent events in his mind. An elite team, traps, and a dragon. This was certainly beyond what a mere human could handle. He decided that as soon as this task was over, he would need to return to Falchion. After all, he had only one body to protect, and in such a case he would need forces capable of stopping the end of the world, even in places where it physically couldn't be. He needed to talk to Sienna about this, and also he was already longing for the alcohol from the crow's nest. After these thoughts, he dozed off. Let's move on to the false knight. The wyvern with blue scales, when it intervened for him, somehow transported him into a cave. He was exhausted, having spent much of his divine power in the skirmishes with the elder mage. There was no such thing, he thought. At what point did the amount of divine power decrease, which can be used at once? Perhaps it happened after the deal with the Ashen Witch, or when he started using Gulachab. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice. The girl who appeared before him declared that he was, in fact, a useless pawn, because of which the dragon Oxychros died. If it hadn't been for the contract with an Exagus, this wouldn't have happened. Everlock uttered the girl's name, Dragon Tadere Lyolark. The girl gave him a stern look and said that she had never given him permission to call her by her name. She continued, saying that this useless one not only bungled things, but also failed to fulfill the terms of the contract, which meant one thing: he needed to be killed. The fallen knight began to justify himself, saying that although he couldn't gather the divine swords, he had something that could atone for his guilt, namely the key to the barrier wall. Tadere agreed that it was indeed not bad, and decided to give him another chance. She was curious to see if he would live up to her expectations. At the table sat Dalen, Edgar, and Lucia. The mercenary was served lunch right at the negotiation table to quickly restore his strength. But the girl was irritated when he tried to say something with his mouth full. In his defense, he said that in the places he was from, they used to say that if you die after lunch, the ghost would be beautiful and sweet. Dalen asked if it was true that one of the knight's treasures was stolen. According to the game's plot, Everlock had stolen the swords when fleeing, but since the uprising was quickly dealt with, something might have changed. Lucia told him that the treacherous knight had taken one of the keys to the barrier wall. As we know, the headquarters of the Sacred Knights in the chasm are surrounded by a mountain barrier and covered by a wall of mana so that monsters cannot get through. Edgar continued that fortunately only one key was kept in the third sanctuary. Although it could weaken the barrier wall, it would not be possible to remove it completely. And most importantly, it would require time to activate. To use the key, one would need the authority of a commander. Dalen said he would help with this issue. Lucia was surprised, to which he asked if that was the reason she had told him everything. The girl agreed, but felt awkward asking for his help again, since he had already done so much for them. The hero interrupted her and asked if the squad was ready for the task, to which Lucia replied that the Inquisitors and the highest-ranking Sacred Knights, as well as Felver and his apprentice Tomi, were ready. Dalen said he was a mercenary, and if the right price was offered, he would go anywhere. The girl asked what the cost would be. The mercenary started to raise his price, saying that in order to track Everlock, they would have to descend into the chasm and pass through the Sacred Knight's defense line, and that was the same as walking into the mouth of a monster. Dalen announced that he would have 3 requests. The mercenary used the eye of the researcher. The deputy commander was indeed located in the chasm. During the application of the sacred tattoo, Edgar thanked Dalen for his immeasurable help, to which he replied that the Sacred Knights had also helped him in many ways. Ideally, after applying the sacred tattoo, one should rest for at least a week, but this was already the 3rd one in 10 days. The first 2 were as payment for previous tasks, the 3rd one as an advance for a new task. The squad set out for the mission. On Dalen's belt was the sacred axe, which was the 2nd payment. He never thought he would acquire such a sacred relic so easily. Probably the commander-in-chief thought it would be fair, considering the danger of the mission. One of the high-ranking knights addressed the mercenary, saying that it was an honor for him to participate in the same mission with the Dragon Slayer. After that, he began praising Dalen for all his achievements. He reminded him of Gallius in some ways. The mercenary thought about Lucia and how she was doing. She stayed in the order, as she was already a full-fledged knight, and needed to train Perun, while she could also train herself, as she understood that she had something to strive for. Dalen glanced at the elder, who was usually more talkative, but since the battle in the sanctuary he had been quiet. The travelers had almost reached the 3rd supply fortress. After it, there were still 2 days of travel to the Estria fortress. The deeper they went into the chasm, the more its landscape began to resemble a labyrinth. The Estria River, which flows through the chasm, forms a border downstream, dividing the territories of humans and monsters. The Estria fortress was built on the riverbank and is the 2nd largest defensive base. To reach it, one must pass through 3 fortresses. One of the knights said that after the Estria fortress, they would have to move without stopping. So he suggested reviewing the plan in detail. The knights assumed that Everlock was on the other side of the river, in the Devil's Valley. It is a region where large and small valleys twist and constantly turn. It would be quite nice not to get lost, but fortunately, the elder had the ability of Earth's memory. In addition, Dalen had the eye of the researcher. The mercenary became alert, feeling something was wrong, and announced to the group that they needed to hurry and reach the 3rd fortress as quickly as possible. Their approach was noticed by the sentries, who ordered the gates to be raised. Upon entering the fortress courtyard, the squad heard that the knights were retrieving weapons from the storerooms. One of them came out to meet the group. The mercenary asked what was going on, and he led them to the lookout fortress. An army of 1,000 gnolls was approaching. The archers began to fire the first arrows, but their number was nothing compared to the number of gnolls. Dallin thought that if the Chongren army had already reached the supply fortress, it meant the front line, the Estria fortress, had been breached. And this fortress, where they were, was just a supply base. It didn't have enough resources or people to stop such a large number of enemies. The fall of the fortress was just a matter of time. In that case, the mercenaries should defeat their commander as quickly as possible. Dalen called out to the high-ranking knight, telling him to keep an eye on the fortress, while he activated the leap skill, jumped over the fence and rushed towards the gnolls. The mercenary knew that to reduce their numbers, he needed to use spells with a large area of effect, so he used the Fire Rain skill. After such a move, their commander should have appeared, and that's exactly what happened. One of the sacred knights was watching the events unfold, in the middle of the Gnoll army, finally getting to see the Dragon Slayers battle firsthand. He was so mesmerized that he almost ended up in the jaws of one of the monsters. If not for the Elder's magic, he would definitely have said goodbye to life. Tomi shouted that the monsters were approaching Zone 11. He said he would deal with them. The Elder, scanning the Gnoll army, thought there were too many of them, and the area that needed protection was too vast. But they couldn't surrender. They had to do something. Dallin fought without rest. He could not afford to yield. After all, a large territory was the minimum required to be considered an archmage. He decided, using the memories of the land, to see the future of all living beings standing upon it. With the size of his territory, he could control the entire battlefield. But something went wrong. The mage collapsed to his knees as if his strength had been drained. Perhaps the blow from the deputy commander in the ruins was stronger than he had anticipated. His body in such a state was unable to withstand such a vast territory. Concerned, Tomi rushed to his teacher, asking him not to push himself to the limit. And then it happened. His student announced the victory. Dallin had succeeded in overthrowing the Gnoll commander. In that moment, the mage received a vision from the memories of the earth. He saw that the mercenary had lived countless lives. After seeing this, he vomited blood. The negotiation table at the third fortress. Inquisitor Pidna spoke. She did not approve of continuing the mission in such a state. Another knight declared that the original objective was to take the key to the barrier wall from Everlock. Pidna continued, arguing that the Gnoll army came from the chasm, which meant that the Estria fortress had fallen into the hands of the enemy, and it had served as a base for the search for the deputy commander. It was necessary to return for reinforcements from headquarters. After listening to this speech, the deputy chief inquisitor, Domer, said that Pidna spoke just like commanders from the secular world. Opinions were divided, and a suggestion was made to vote. Dallin raised his hand in favor of continuing the mission, adding that even if no one agreed, he would go alone. 2 days later, the group approached the Estria fortress, or rather, what was left of it. Pidna still went with them, as she had a different mindset, but she acted responsibly as any sacred knight should. Smoke could be seen, which was an ominous sign, and they moved faster. At the ruins of the fortress sat a false knight. He appeared to be in a crazed state. He exclaimed that he had been waiting for Dallin, calling him a barbarian from the north, to which the mercenary cursed, calling him a traitor to the god. Everlock laughed and said that his god was still with him and had granted him infinite power. Domer could not bear such blasphemous words and charged at the traitor with his weapon. Our hero pondered, when Everlock became a defiled knight, he was granted the power of the evil god Lapilum. Having captured the Estria fortress, he could have done 3 things. Use it as a base for an army of monsters, with dragons at the helm, or open massive gates to hell, or offer the entire fortress to Lapilum as a phantom palace. After thinking a bit more, he had no doubt that it was the third option. The mercenary prepared to strike with the sacred sword. Throwing the blade before him at the enemy, it plunged in as if into glass. He pulled the earth, bound to the distorted space, to increase the distance between them. With the sword, Dallin cut through the entrance to the space and flew into it. It was nothing other than hell, a special realm belonging to the 5 evil gods. Through it, one could reach the phantom palace of Lipayima. Dallin fell into the Garden of Emptiness. Since the ceremony hadn't been completed yet, this wasn't a true phantom palace. It seemed to hang over reality like a dome. That's why the mercenary was able to win. The more you resist in the Garden of Emptiness, the stronger it pulls you inside. Dallin needed that, as one of his corpses was deep within that garden. He quickly reached his target. The mercenary looted the corpse. Mastery, sensitivity, intelligence, and mana increased by 1 point. A window popped up, informing that the character had been abundantly filled with divine power. The Garden of Emptiness, created with the mana of an evil god, could only be opposed by using divine power. The newly gained skill was quite useful. Embers of Sacred Fire, a skill that turns any fire into sacred fire. The mercenary used the Fire Rain skill, and the Gardens of Emptiness ignited. Everlock was furious. Once again, Dallin had ruined his plans. The Dark Knight began to transform into a half-monster. Our hero used his new skill. His power proved stronger than he had imagined, as the dome instantly started to crumble. However, Dallin didn't feel well. Probably it was a side effect of having too much energy pass through him. But he didn't hesitate for long. There was no time for that. The sky was torn apart by flashes of lightning as the two opponents clashed on the battlefield. With a single swing of the divine sword, the mercenary cleaved the air, releasing a blinding stream of light. The magical wave bounced off the monster's armor, but left deep cracks on it. Again and again, they exchanged blows. The false knight showered his opponent with curses, which Dallin dealt with easily. Our protagonist rushed for his final jump, driving his weapon into the cursed heart of the traitor. A deafening scream echoed. The sky lit up with crimson light, and the monster fell, bleeding dark, smoking blood. It was over. The elder asked Dallin if everything was all right, to which he nodded and thought that the elder should be worrying about himself at the moment. Domer approached our hero, expressing his true gratitude for delivering punishment to the defiled Holy Knight. Pidna joined their conversation, pointing out that neither the Holy Sword of Numislark nor the key to the barrier wall was here, both of which the traitor had taken with him. The mage had an idea. He decided, with the help of reading the Earth's memories, to read Everlock's past. The mercenary noted the fact that the elder now had much less power than the last time when he was showing territories. After a little while, the mage said that the deputy commander should hand over the key and his holy sword, Chongrin, which would be used to implement a new plan to destroy the knights and kill their commander. The group is heading to Chongrin's nest, but first they needed to sail along the river on a vessel, and preparations for departure were underway. Dallin asked the elder if he would be able to continue their mission, to which he gave an affirmative answer. The mage wondered how, after living so many lives, the mercenary could show such persistence and willpower. He became curious about what exactly the mercenary wanted to protect, and what true goal he was pursuing.